This interview is part of our Master Folio Series at the College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University, where we are interviewing three of our former adjunct or full-time professors who have retired in the last few years and who have meant so much to us in the past. Today's interview is with John Sheoris. And John, welcome.
It's nice to be here, Glenn. Now, would you prefer that I refer to you as Dean or Glenn?
Glenn is just fine.
Okay.
It's what my mother and father called me, and I've been comfortable with it ever since.
With me, it's also John in lieu of Professor.
Very good. Well, John, what we are doing in this series is interviewing people that have meant a lot to us in terms of their teaching and scholarship and their contributions to the lives of students and our faculty. And we're trying to find out a little bit about their lives and what made them tick in terms of their professional careers in teaching. So I'd like to just start off very early on with your reasons initially for wanting to be an architect.
Well, I guess I was fostered by parents. And, you know, as most parents can recognize talents in their children. And my parents both recognized that I enjoyed drawing. And so during my elementary and grade school years, I continued to draw until such time that I went to high school. And this I continued at high school. I went to a high school in New York City, because originally I am from New York, born and bred and raised in New York. And I went to a school that was by admission, by exam, and by evidenced scholarship. And we had four of those schools in New York City, one of which was Bronx Science, another which was Brooklyn Polytech, one Stuyvesant, which is Lower Manhattan, and there was a fourth, which was Townsend Harris. Perhaps it was named by some governor back in the 1800s. But I went there and I continued my drawing. I took all of the academic subjects. I took the chemistry, I took physics, the math, all of that which was required. And in addition to that, they had mechanical drawing as an option. And so I took mechanical drawing as well. And then when I moved on to my junior and senior years, I noted that, continuing with my academics, I noted that they had some options and electives that I could take. One of which in one of the years was mechanical drawing. It was called drawing. And the other was architectural design. And so I took those subjects along with the others and discovered that upon graduation, I'd received all of the award certificates for it. And in addition to that, I was also given a medal, which was, I think, made my life at that point in time.
That pretty well sealed your fate, right? You were going to go study to be an architect.
That is right.
Was it in that era, in that time when you were taking your architecture courses in high school that you had the aha moment, I want to be an architect, or was it long before that?
I believe it was later, just slightly later than that. It was upon graduating. But prior to graduating, I joined the Navy in lieu of being drafted into the Army. When I say joined, I enlisted at 17 years old, and that was in World War II. Mm-hmm. And they, of course, by law, they couldn't induct me into the Navy. I had to finish high school, and they allowed me the 2 or 3 months that I had until I reached my 18th birthday. And reaching that birthday, I was inducted into the Navy and was discharged, and I do remember that one date. I do remember, I guess we all do as retired veterans. It was July the 7th, 1946. And that was a long, long time ago. So now I've established my age. But anyway, with that, and it was at that point in time, in that interim period of 2 to 3 months that I had, the architect who had presented the medal to me hired me as an office boy. I would much rather to say that it was a gopher and not so much an office boy. And so when I started there, and the first day I arrived, he gave me a key, and I was wondering, what is the key for? But I soon found out what the key was for. He said, you're going to be the first one in the office and the last one out of the office. And at that time, in 1944, 45, early 45, the office was in downtown New York in the Wall Street area. And they had 20-story, 15, 16-story high-rises there. But we didn't have air conditioning. And so one of my chores every morning was to go into the office and then roll back the linoleum covers that we had on top of the boards, which preserved and kept the soot with the air conditioning that we didn't have, kept the soot off these drawings. Another chore, and then in addition to that, I had to go to the 3 or 4 drafting tables that were there because we didn't have mechanical pencils at that time. But we had to sharpen, I had to sharpen all of the draftsmen's pencils and leave about, I would say at least a half an inch of lead. And then once having done that, I would have to sand the edges to a chisel point so that they could perform the artistry of drafting. And there were 3, as I remember, the 3 draftsmen, they could have been architects for all I know, and I, as the office boy, the principal was an architect, and a secretary. But I did learn some things at that point in time. Then shortly thereafter, I went into the Navy, and then that's when certain things happened. You know.
So, John, you got out of the Navy, and then you started moving into your architectural education. How did that come about?
Well, it came about by the fact that, you know, I was in the service for 2 years. Others had been in the service for 4 and 3 years. And when we applied for universities and colleges and schools, whatever it may have been, you were admitted on points, but that was secondary. Firstly, I guess that was primary, and then secondly, on your academic and on your scholastic aptitudes. So I had to wait for the 4 and 3 year guys to get to school first. We had very temporary facilities in all of these universities. They had tempos for classrooms.
And there was a huge rush of GIs coming into college.
Hundreds of thousands
for the very first time.
Veterans, and the guys who were in there for 5, 4, 3 years had preference over me. So I finally got in there. It was like about 1947, and I entered Cooper in I took an exam.
That's Cooper Union.
At Cooper Union for the advancement of science and art, and that was by exam and scholastic evidence as well. And there were 3 or 4 veterans in the class, and the other 12 or so were young people who just got out of high school. And I enjoyed the instructors there. It was I can't tell you how much I learned at Cooper. It was just unbelievable because we had the exodus of all of these professors and teachers who came in from Europe, either went to Chicago or with Gropius up to Harvard, and people like Maholi Nagy, who was at Pratt Institute at the time. And she was teaching, and our class would run over there and sit for some of her class. And learned from her, Georgie Kepish, I believe that was her husband.
Yes.
And all of the instructors were mostly European. As a matter of fact, I had Bob Gwathmey, who was Charles Gwathmey's father, who was a painter and artist, and I had him for drawing, and he was great. He was such a wonderful, he was as nice as his son Chuck was, and I remember Chuck from, not that I went to school with him at Yale, but we served on some committees together up at Yale after alumni committees.
So who was the most influential professor that you had over at Cooper Union?
I'll tell you, I had them all. I had Philip Johnson. I had Elliot Noyes, Lou Kahn. It'd be, again, a litany. of guys that I had. They were all, and George Howe was our dean at the time of Howe and Les Caz, who was out of Philadelphia. And he and Lou Kahn at the time, because George Howe and he were neighbors, so to speak, in Philadelphia, would come in to Yale University for the 4 to 5 days a week during the week. And Lou was our chief design critic. And I had him in my junior and senior years, and he was by far the guy who most influenced me. Mm-hmm. He just talked, and he credited others for his being where he was. And he talked to me about Mies van der Rohe. He says, you know, you need to really look at this guy because he really has a certain order and discipline in his planning. Then he says, Corbusier, you look at him for volume and mass. And then he said, don't forget Frank Lloyd Wright, because I never considered him as part of being in the international school. But he was a modernist, and perhaps he may have been unbeknownst to me.
So Kahn had some fondness and respect for Wright as well?
Oh, yes. Yes, he did. Yes, he did, in terms of materials and his use of material. And what Kahn did successfully, though, is to blend. His contribution was to blend light with all of these three principles.
Yes. Do you feel like having Kahn as a studio instructor, that he wanted you to be the best designer you could be, develop your own philosophy and style about architecture, or was he attempting to have you follow his style or someone else's style?
No, I think he was very free in his allocation as to who he might want to do, and we all thought that way, everybody at Yale. Although we had, I'll tell you, we had a cadre of people at Yale, and there weren't too many. The class at Yale was 17 because in the year before, there were only 17 of us in the class. A year before, we had almost half the class go into the Korean War. Fortunately, I'd served in the Second World War, and I didn't have to serve in this one, so I was free and easy. But I'll tell you the one thing that did occur. Having learned all of the, you see, Yale was very different. It was a culture up there, it was different. And I'm so pleased that I met all of those people, and students as well. And I'll tell you who some of those students were. But prior to that, it was a culture that really grabbed hold of me up there. Hugh Jacobson was in the class behind me. And the class behind him was Jimmy Polshak. But we all shared the same studio, I mean the same space. The forward end were the freshmen, and the seniors were at the end, the other end. And the one thing that we had there, which was nice, which I didn't see much of this while I was teaching, whether it be here or elsewhere. I didn't see the camaraderie that would occur. We would, as seniors, we'd finish a project, or as juniors, we'd finish a project. But we always had the assistance and help of the freshmen. And also the juniors as a senior. You'd ask them, well, could you please poche this plan for me, or could you do this for me and that for me? But the concepts and everything else and the ideas and suggestions were yours. And so that was, and then of course in the essence of doing a model, you know, you'd have some kind of help. Would you cut this for me, and so I could
make
place
trees
it together?
for my model was always the big one.
That kind of thing.
So do you think back then there was more camaraderie among students than there is today?
I think there was.
So why do you think that's so?
The funny part of it was the competition existed as it exists now amongst students. But the difference being is that we all worked together. It wasn't the same kind of, it wasn't shielding your drawing or anything. But when I got to Yale, I'll tell you, the guys, I felt as if I really knocked their socks off, having learned what I learned from these professors at Cooper Union. And it was very different, very different. And, you know, we would, with the start of any project that was given to us by any of the instructors, I was the first to start, and I was the last to finish. And being the first to start, the others didn't start until I got further into the project, so they could see, well, which direction is he taking? What is he doing? But I didn't have, you know, I never faulted these guys. We had a wonderful relationship. I mean, I'd have, who was it, Hugh Jacobson, coming over, having won a fellowship later on, you know, from, I had Hugh, who was in back of me. He spent some time with me, sort of trying to find out what did I do on this scholarship that he should do in order to get the fellowship, you see.
Well, I certainly, from my experience in architecture school, it's such a unique culture where you make friends for life.
Oh, yeah.
Did you find that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You know, I've had, Hugh Jacobson was here twice. When he was here the second time, he had a book. It was about that thick and about that big and wide, beautifully done, and with beautiful projects as well. And I didn't come to his second lecture because I'd heard him the first time. And, you know, I knew exactly what it was that he was going to say. But he left the book for me with the dean.
That's nice.
To John, thank you very much for not attending tonight, something to that effect, you know. You know it all, whatever. And that was it. And I still have that book. As I have a book autographed by Frank Lloyd Wright from Cooper Union when he addressed a talk in the Great Hall.
Oh, that must be wonderful.
And that book was Genius and the Mobocracy, and I have that.
Very good.
So,
Well,
anyway.
you know, in the 1950s, you got a chance to travel to Europe. Were you still in school then? And how influential was that in your life?
Well, what happened is, having graduated, I couldn't exercise the fellowship. It was a 52 fellowship. I could not exercise that until I fully graduated. And with that, there was a proviso that you would have to serve an assistantship of some sort. So I went to Europe, spent 6 months in Europe. I was married at the time. It was my last year at Yale. It was my first year of marriage. And my wife worked at the law school. I'm going to get a little political now. And she was typing speeches for Adlai Stevenson. That's just how far back I go. So you're talking, the only thing I don't have is a beard. You'd have to contend with.
I'm probably one of the only people here today that also remembers Adlai Stevenson. But
Anyway.
so you went to Europe, and how did that enrich your experience? How
Well,
important
it
is it
did,
for students
because-
to travel today?
Because you know, all of those things that I had learned from my history professors and others at both Cooper Union with Paul Zucker, who was the historian, and also with Christopher Tunnard and Vince Scully at Yale. I had those instructors as well. Christopher Tunnard for what they called at that time city planning. It was not yet urban planning, it was city planning at that time. And Vince Scully, of course, was a great guy also, exciting individual, gave lectures on the history of architecture. So having gone there, looking at all of these slides and listening to all of these people, I saw, in fact, the beauty of some of these antiquities and buildings that were structured from the Romanesque through the Renaissance, and also to look at some of the Corbusier buildings as well that I was fond of. And also the social and cultural aspects.
To your advice to students today about travel?
Oh, I would suggest that they travel. There's no, and they're doing that. And that's something that we here also in Lawrence Tech initiated some, I would say could have been about 12 years ago, where we actually, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, where we actually had them visiting Europe, and specifically always Paris, France. And then from there, they had some free time, and they made junctures to other parts of the country, which some of our professors who were there were always concerned about, because they never knew where they would and whether they'd be able to make their flight back to the United States later in time.
How hard was it to get your first job in the profession after graduating?
Well, it was hard, but then again, it was easy because I had a bit of experience. One of my professors at Cooper, at Cooper Union, mentioned to us in class that, you know, in order for you to really understand and to expect from the profession of architecture, what you need to do and ought to do is work during the summer months and during your summer recess. And so I took that instead, and I did that. And I walked the street. I'd take my portfolio the very first week that I was out of school, and I'd walk the streets of New York, and there we had an architectural row on Madison and Madison Avenue and on Lexington Avenue, but there were quite a few down in Wall Street, and I was more familiar with Wall Street. And I went down there, and I got my first job. But he also, in the same breath, he said, you know, when you take on something for the summer, what you need to do is not go back to the same office, but look for other offices that vary in scope, in size, and the typology of that office. And I did that. I worked for 5, 6 different offices in those years that I'd gone to school, which was very helpful. And again, I knew so much more than some of these students up at Yale, and it was really worth it all.
It's because you had been building it for so many years.
Absolutely. So when I, you talk about some of these other accomplishments beyond the scholarship or fellowship, you know, is getting these jobs. And you know, it wasn't hard. I didn't have to make phone calls. I just went into the office and I talked to the receptionist. I said, I want to talk to somebody that's, you know, that does the hiring. And most often, because in a smaller office, it was a principal that walked out. It wasn't
in those days, there was no human resource director. It was
exactly,
the principal.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it was great. And I made some very good friends.
So what were some of the early firms that you worked for?
Well, I worked for Hohauser, who gave me the Hohauser, I've forgotten his first name, for the Hohauser medal, so to speak, when I was in high school. After that, I worked for Adolf Novak. I worked for John Graham and Company. I worked for Warner Leeds. They were a sharp, young firm, and very few people, very more principled perhaps than the others in terms of architecture. You know. And then, of course, when I came back from Europe, and I served up at Yale, I went with the firm of Reisner and Urban. Jed Stowe Reisner and both Urban were graduates of Illinois. Urban later became our national president of the American Institute of Architects. But he was a great guy. I mean, I guess it was after the war, and he was I think he was a retired general of some sort. Non-combat, I'm sure. But in administrative work, but he made a lot of friends, political friends. And so he did the enclosure for the rocket, the Apollo, the one that went up, the one that moves along with on a tractor in order to get to the housing, and that's a big thing. And so we did a lot of work for the Army at that time in the Air Force and others.
Okay. Yeah. When did you decide to make a transition? And I know you've always maintained one hand in practice, but when did you decide to make a transition into teaching?
First of all, when I got out of school, or prior to getting out of school, working in the various offices, each of these offices had not a department for design, depending on the office. They had a drafting room, then they had a corner somewheres, or maybe a closet of some sort, where they had one, maybe two younger people. When I say young, not as young as I, of course, but with some experience. And as I recall at Reisner and Urban's, it was Glenn Paulson, who had just come back, and he worked for many years. I think it was a U of M graduate, worked for Saarinen. And he had a scholarship to attend the Royal Academy Sweden, or Denmark, or wherever. And he spent a year there and came back. Now, Reisner was the designer in the office. Not that Urban couldn't design, but he wasn't interested in that. He was more interested in marketing. And as a matter of fact, when I watched Mr. Urban walk through the office, fully dressed, beautifully dressed, I always imagined a cocktail glass in his hand because he was so involved in just bringing in the work. But he was also, he could draw beautifully because he had all of his renderings that he had done as he was coming, just hung all over his office. Just great guy. And beyond that, what was the other part of that question?
Well,
I'm sorry.
just how did you make that transition into teaching from
Well, I have
professional
to,
life?
first I have to go beyond that and say that I worked as a draftsman during the summer months, and I did that also when I got out and worked for Reisner and Urban. But there I met Glenn Paulson, who was a designer for Reisner and Urban. And we would, the younger people in the office, I would always hang in. Every time I'd leave my drawing board to go to the John or wherever, to the can, and I'd always pass by the design room, and I'd look at him and say, "Hi, Glenn," and all of that. And I learned a lot from just watching him draw, just going in there during the lunch hour and looking at the drawings. But we did more than that during lunch. I would hang in with these designers, and there were 3 of them in that room, as I remember. And I'd go out to lunch with them. Of course, I spent all of my salary going to lunch with these guys, and I had to borrow money from my mother in order, or my wife, who was working at the time, to get into the city, because I took the subway to work. But that's where I learned. At lunchtime, we went and watched Lever House being built. We watched Chase Manhattan downtown being built. We watched all of these buildings being done. I think the very last one we might have looked at the hole that was being done, may have looked at the hole that was being done for the Seagram's Tower that Lambert and Philip Johnson.
So it was
leased
important to you to establish a network of people in the profession.
Absolutely, because these were like the nice part about having worked during the summers. I had these captive mentors, and I had a question to ask, and they would be very gracious in their responding to the question.
Most architects deep down want to be teachers, don't they?
Well, I have that. No, with me it was a little different. It was more than that. I kept a foot in teaching. When I say that, when I got here is when I became more pronounced in that area. Working as a designer, a director of design, and whatever, when I first came here to Detroit. As a matter of fact, when I told my wife we were going to Detroit, her jaw dropped and her eyes opened. And I said, "Well, I promise if we don't like it in Detroit," and that was some 50 years ago, I said, "We'll go on to Chicago, and then from Chicago, if we don't like Chicago, we'll move on to San Francisco." We never did.
You're still here.
We're still here. I think everybody here, the schools and whatever. I served as a juror, being a director of design, or at that time we called them chief designers. They weren't all directors. It wasn't director until I moved into Smith, Hinchman, and Grill, and they were a bit more sophisticated than Harley, Ellington, Cowan, and Sturton were at that time. Now I think it's a little different. I think Harley Devereaux is more sophisticated than Smith Group may be, but that's just my opinion. But it's what goes around comes around. I know all of these young people who are very talented at Harley Devereaux, serving on committees and whatever with him. And I remember, as an example, Art Smith as a student. Yeah, seeing him at conferences, conventions. He would go to these things and learn, which is very
as
helpful.
you established your network, he established his.
What happened is, it's the old Peter's principle. I was designing. My second job after Reisner and Urban, I went for design, and I worked as a designer. but I knew how to do contract documentation also. That wasn't, but I said an architect needs to be a designer. He can't be a draftsman. That's what makes the difference between one and the other. So I designed, and being a chief designer or director of design, I was called at UAD as a critic, as a juror, not as a critic, as a juror, University of Michigan as a juror, and also Lawrence Tech with Pellerin, Dean Pellerin, and then later with Carl. And so I enjoyed doing that. And then some of the instructors wanted me to come in here at Lawrence and give a talk in the auditorium to a class, and I did that. And I enjoyed it very much. And now I was being advanced beyond a designer to a point of, more administration. As a designer at Smith, Hinchman and Grills, I had a dozen people doing the design for us. Of course, I would establish the conceptual stuff. I'd be working nights to do that, bringing it into the office, reviewing it with our young people, and there's another young man that was in our office. He's in Chicago now, running one of the Smith offices, and Andy Vizano. Andy Vizano. He was in my department. He was a numbers crusher because he was more interested in programming. So he worked out of my design department at Smith Hinchman as a numbers crusher, working out the programming, as did Arnie Micon, who later became the CEO at Smith, Hinchman and Grills, and since that time, we've had several other CEOs, I believe. Carl is now, Carl is the
Carl
guy
Rowling.
there, Carl Rowling. But, so I moved up from associate, and I had a share as a vice president, and I was totally involved. And I got to the point where, what am I doing running a division of 100 some odd people? And I was in charge of a division, and that division was health facilities, laboratories. And the division worked itself up to about 130. But I wasn't that much interested, although I was in design, and I watched those young guys designing there, but I wasn't the director of design at that time. I was merely a vice president in charge of the division and looking at computer dumps and looking at numbers, and that wasn't for me. So
It wasn't as fun as designing, right?
It was not. It wasn't, well, I didn't feel as if I was an architect. I was more an accountant than I was an architect. So I I said, I've got to do something about it. So subliminally, I checked people, and I talked to Carl. Or no, when somehow or another he'd heard, as others did. And so I had all the deans calling me up to come out and join them in their faculty. And at that time, I had a boat in the water because I was a boater as well. That was my avocation, so to speak. And I figured, well, to get to, by the time I got to Michigan and back, I'd have expended about 3 hours in travel time. I didn't want to do that. I really didn't want to go to the University of Detroit for other reasons, but I did end up with Carl because at that time they were working on 696. It was only a 30-minute drive from Grosse Pointe to Southfield.
So about what year was that?
Pardon me?
About what year was that?
I would say that was like about 1980. 1980, 80. No, maybe it was later than that. But I was taking the long route prior to that. But I knew that this would have happened, and so I put my money on the limitation of time and the more time that I could spend with students. And so
So you joined the full-time faculty?
When I came here, I was an adjunct teaching at nights.
Okay.
And then Carl said, we've got to do something with our night program, which was a graduate program beyond the undergraduates. And so he asked me to look at some of that and help him structure that to bring it up into the day course. But I taught it for about 2 or 3 years at night. I taught philosophy and architecture and some other things, not so much design at that point in time also, and I lectured. But we moved it up into the day program, and I was the director doing all of the stuff that needed to be done at that time. But we didn't have fancy titles. Right. I did most of the work. Right. Carl was very gracious in allowing me to do that, but he was a great, he was a good dean. You know, tough but good. I recall there were times when I remember with other instructors where the student didn't get the grade that he anticipated or thought he would get, and the guy would say, go to the dean and review it with the dean. The dean would listen to him and say goodbye, and that was it. And there wasn't any of that. I mean, he was very, very tough as an instructor. I mean, he wasn't a guy that issued a lot of A's or a lot of B's in his classes. Right. But he was very forgiving. He was very good with students. He had 2 sons. And, you know, when you have children, there are some forgiving things that you'll, you know, hang on to.
Certainly. We taught for approximately 30 years here at Lawrence Tech.
No, it was less. I would say, well, yeah, I taught from about 1979 through about 2005. I formally retired in 2001, but I came back for the graduate program again because the new dean at that time didn't, you know, he wanted to get some historical background on it.
But as a full-time professor and an adjunct, over 30 years.
Oh,
then.
Well, would it have been 30 years? Or let's say take
25,
79.
I mean,
it's
you
not
retired
quite.
as
It's
an
about
adjunct
20.
around 2008, 2009.
Well, yes,
so.
I've been, but I haven't been, you know, I haven't been active, I would say, in the last 3 years, other than to come in knowing that there was a...
So 25 to 30 years, so somewhere in that range.
Oh, somewhere, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. But
We're
it
not
sounds
going to
more...
about a few years.
I think I didn't realize it was...
Nearly 3 decades.
No, but I was an adjunct lecturer at Columbia University when I was working at Smith, Inchman and Grills.
Well, in all those years, what were some of your most gratifying moments?
Oh my God, can I look at some of these things? There's so many. When you say gratifying, it was...
As a professor, what were your most... we can edit this out, but you can go look at page 5.
5, is that the question that was asked? Okay.
By the way, you're doing really well, and it sounds like a what do you think, natural conversation?
That is a statement. You see, when you asked me about that, I started to not to structure a response to it, but I tried to start with having graduated with a medal in architecture, going all the way through, and it was a litany. It would never stop. When I got to the gold medal, everything stopped. But there were so many things that had happened between that time that rather than say that, I sat and I wrote a statement. I wrote a statement that says, I said, attending professional events, meetings, conferences, and presentations and other, meeting and seeing students who were now colleagues and have matured beautifully in their profession, many of which I've had. And also those intimately engaged in AIA functions, committees, receiving awards for their contributions in the profession as well. But in addition to that, there were so many that you and I know and recognize that have and were and are in their very own practice, and others who, as principals and factors with many firms throughout the country, local and many celebrated firms throughout the country, and that is so. It just makes me feel that I've contributed something. And so, lastly, they're graciously remembering, thinking, and acknowledging me for their personal accomplishments and comforts in life. To me, it was so rewarding. It's so rewarding.
So
those were
your
the
greatest achievements as a professor
That's
then
right.
were in reveling in the achievements of your students.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, not my own, you know.
Yeah. But a couple of years ago, you received AIA Detroit's gold medal.
Oh, well, I
How,
did
how
that.
important was that
I
to
did
you?
that. Well, again, there's another question here. Let me see. Okay, these were achievements. These were achievements. You know, they were results, so to speak. And I said, you know, achievements were noted in biographical information that was sent to you some time ago. It would be wordy and very tedious for me to further respond to this question. And so perhaps a statement on my feelings with respect to achievement and accomplishment is better explained by the following. And so I wrote here, and it seems to be a little formal, but I suppose the longer you're around, the more widely known to your colleagues you may be. And to be here on this day is an accomplishment in itself. And it offers me the opportunity to thank all my colleagues and others that I'm able to share this achievement with. And it's simply stated. I can give you a litany, but it would be endless. But absolutely, it would stop with the gold medal, other than your, you know, graciously asking me to be part of an interview.
You know, we're going to have an exhibition of your work and your colleagues' work. You know, Harvey Ferraro and Joe Sabin and you, and so we're going to select some work of yours. You're going to help us select a project or two to display. What do you think? First of all, talk a little bit about the project or projects that you think are your most important professional projects that you've undertaken, and what makes them so important?
Well, I guess, you know, I've been involved in the very large, the moderately sized, and the smaller projects. And the most important, certainly, in terms of utilitarian projects, were the hospitals that I designed when I was with Smith, Hinchman and Grills. And many of them have been given awards by the Michigan Society as well as the AID. And so there were many people that were responsible with me in design and putting these things forward. And the concepts, of course, I generated, but the concepts in all of these hospitals were very pragmatic. They were simple statements. They were not there weren't any metaphors. There was nothing celestial. They were just simple statements. Nothing cosmic, nothing celestial.
They worked as hospitals and helped heal people.
And exactly.
Yes.
And but in themselves, though, they were buildings that you could sculpt. I mean, you could design a hospital within a box. You know, if you wanted to take the Miesian route, you could perhaps do a hospital, but it would have to be a smaller hospital to do it. But then you'd be encumbered by the fact that you couldn't possibly expand that hospital. If it had to expand, how would you handle the surgery? Where would you expand? It would be very difficult to do that. And that's why many of our hospitals, and even prior to my getting involved with them, looked like a chaotic mass of some sort with all of these appendages sitting and not really designed as appendages on the hospital. But the best way to have done a hospital, and especially so in a green field, and even in an urban context, is to actually break up your masses. Think in terms of your diagnostic elements, your therapeutic elements. Your diagnostic, of course, would be the laboratories, pathology, and things of that nature. But you design these as blocks hanging on to perhaps a patient unit, and being able to expand these blocks, expand surgery, expand radiology, expand emergency. And so many of my hospitals have done that. I don't recall, other than one that I did for the Army, which was actually a rectangle of some sort with a patient unit sitting on top of it. But all others, such as Weber, the Weber addition in a medical center to Harper Hospital, Crittenton Hospital, which was designed way back in that was one of the first projects I did for Smith, Hinchman and Grills in 1963, and it was completed, I believe, in 1966. But that in itself was planned that way, but unfortunately, you have to know the psyche of an administrator. I mean, they were difficult people to work with. They were probably the most difficult client that I was ever privileged, so to speak, to work with. But tough guys, and they always looked, at that time, they always looked for. So even though you design your hospital as an open-ended hospital, they'd hire some other architect. Right. And it was also always a matter of economics, you know, well, we were too expensive or whatever, and things of that nature. And so, unfortunately, Crittenton is as I had thought it would be, having finished the expansion that is on paper for the expansion part of it.
Moving from the complexity of the hospital, one of the projects that you wrote to us about was an addition to a home.
Yes,
a more modest.
That's right.
A more modest project.
And that's one that I feel very close to.
So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'll talk about it. First of all, I was the client for that house.
That's your own house. Is that your house in Grosse Pointe?
In addition to being the architect, it was a house.
Is that hard to be your own client?
Well, not really. For me, it was very easy. Very easy. Of course, I had my wife watching over me, but it wasn't as if I was doing a kitchen or a bathroom. I was adding 300 feet as a studio for a retired architect, so to speak. And actually a place to have that second cup of coffee in the morning, you know, and that's why I did that. And it's great. And I think you visited my studio.
I have.
Been there.
I didn't get the all-important second cup, but that's okay.
But anyway, that my house was developed and designed by a design-build firm. And the design-build firm goes way back to the early 50s. And the name of the firm was Cox and Baker. And as I understand it, Baker was a graduate of Florence Tech. Now, you'll have to recall at that time, everybody was doing a contemporary one-story house, no basement, no attics, a ranch. And it was typical to the California ranches, which were being done during the mid-century. And so when I moved into this house 23 years ago, I moved into it because I saw things that I could do with it that would better it. That is the interiors, because there must have been about a half a dozen tenants before I found it as a retirement home. And I dressed up the exterior with the landscaping and whatever. All of our interiors are all mid-century. I mean, my furnishings are Mies, Knoll, Sarin, and they're all in that vein. And so I had to design this so that I could complement what was in the home as opposed to the studio. So it's all one entity. And so I looked at how I could best do this. And I had some problems with the zoning board because I finished my contract documents, and a month earlier, they had a change in the zoning ordinance, and my setback for the studio wasn't what I thought it would be. So I very neatly pulled together a story and went to the zoning ordinance, and I pleaded hardship, I guess. And I guess they went along with me, and I was able to do it. It hasn't harmed the backyard by any means. But the thing that they didn't know is that I had some experience with the Plan Commission. Not that one, which is the Plan Commission in Grosse Pointe Woods. But prior to that, I had spent 23 years with the City of Grosse Pointe Park Plan Commission. 18 of those years as a vice chairman, or normally they'd introduce me as a chairman of vice whenever we had a meeting.
So you knew the ins and outs of how to make a presentation to appeal to a planning board.
I had a pretty good inkling because I watched all of these guys trying to do it, and they just, weren't as successful, in my earlier years. So I've been there, I've done that, and whatever.
You talked about the house being a house of simple ideas. How important is that to you?
So, you look at it. You look at the house. And, 10 years ago, I could make it very different. I could put in a glass box, or I could put in a building that was paneled in metal. But then I said, that would be departing much too much. I had to blend it with what was already there, and what's there is really very handsome, very nice. I applaud both Cox and Baker. They weren't practicing as architects, they practiced as design build. And the guy who was the architect was Baker. So I looked at the building hard. I looked at the front elevation, the side elevation. It was like a binuclear. It's a box that's articulated, but symmetrically articulated. And I looked at the front and the rear, and I saw a header, structural member, that was dividing the lower part of the house with the upper part. Windows below that reached from the floor to the underside of the header, which are approximately 7 feet, and then additional windows on top of the header that went up another 3 feet or so. So I had, within the house itself, it was like about an 11 to 12-foot ceiling. So I said, now I can take that header and move it all the way around the house on this addition, and that would grab hold of the simple box, which later had some articulation drawn into it by angling a wall so I could have a nicer view to the garden, but even more room inside the 300 square feet to do the work in.
And 300 square feet, I mean, that's a relatively small addition, but yet with big impact.
Absolutely,
And
big impact.
when I saw the space, I mean, the things that I was most impressed about is, number one, the relationship between the indoor space and the outdoor space.
Exactly.
I mean, you're indoors, but you're truly in a garden.
Glass. It's all floor-to-ceiling glass.
And so you obviously prize that relationship.
Oh, absolutely.
And then I remember you telling me that there was an antique table that you put in there because you felt that even a contemporary space always had to have one antique piece.
In our younger days, long before we could afford the Saarinen furniture and the Mies furniture and all of that, I always had the feelings, I liked the antiquity and buildings in Europe that were done, like Chartres, the cathedrals, all of these, the different palaces. And so I always liked mixing some of that as a counterpoint. It never, in my home at this point in time, I have two pieces of antiquity, so to speak, in my studio, and then two other pieces in my home. So there is some recall, but what you see is the contemporary. And it's not, and it's impacted by these little points that are so nice to look at too. And what I've placed on those normally is perhaps vegetation, plant of some sort.
John, as we move to the conclusion of this interview, just want to talk a little bit about your advice for students. Obviously, you've been a student and have fond memories of it. You've been a teacher, you've been a professional. And so you have a particular viewpoint that you can offer to students today. So what do you think are the skills and experiences and values, habits that you think are important for students to cultivate as they move into their career?
Well, there are several. But more importantly, I think the matter of dedication is important. And when I think in terms of dedication, what I'd like to see in a student or build into a student is his commitment to architecture. For me, it's important. Or even for him, it would be important that he should not depart from ever thinking about anything else. Because, because architecture is so important to him. And, to me, it was I can tell you that with my wife and I, as younger people, and being an architect, what would we do with our Sunday afternoons? We would go to galleries in New York. Mm-hmm. We would go to Central Park in New York. We would do all of that. Whereas some of my other relatives would be more interested in getting together and just enjoying a meal, a dinner together. And we didn't do that. We were sort of the
family outcast?
The outcasts. We were outcasts, really. And that was one of the reasons for our coming to Detroit in lieu of staying in New York, because, we were just like the black sheep in the family. Uh-huh. And so it's important that he's committed, and he should, and he should never, ever feel that he should depart from that.
So you define yourself as an architect, and it infuses your whole personality,
Absolutely.
Your whole sense of being, and it's where your passion lies.
Yes, yeah,
right?
and that's what it's been like for me. Architecture was first and foremost. Of course, I had family, and I have children. They matter very much in my life, but they do only because I've been so happily involved in my profession. The old story is, there are people that you meet every day who just dislike what they're doing.
Right.
And, you just can't have a life. If you dislike what you're doing, depart from it.
But yet
something else.
Yet a lot of surveys that you see show that architects, despite all of the trials and tribulations of being an architect, are generally content with their career choice.
They are.
Because they're passionate about it,
yeah,
right?
They are.
That's the point that you're trying to make.
Exactly.
What about, there's a big debate right now, particularly with computer graphics coming in, about do architects even have to know how to draw by hand anymore? They can do everything by hand that they can by computer. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I don't have any problems with a computer, because many of my students, and I'll go back as far as 10, 12 years, if not longer, worked with computers, but it was a different student at that time, because they weren't the nerds that they are now with computers. And for me, it was extremely important for a student to know how to draw quickly and professionally, and
by hand.
And then ultimately, if they, when they want to, they get onto the computer. But if you're in the midst of doing some conceptual attitudes or directions that you want to take in your design, the best way to do that, and most often concepts begin either with the brain or with the heart, and ultimately move into the hand with a pencil in hand, and you begin to sketch, and ultimately you come up with some ideas. Today, the student doesn't do that. And we would sketch on paper that exceeded at times the size of the drafting table. But today a student gets onto a computer, or it was at the time that I was teaching with computers, is they get onto a computer, they press a few buttons, they just obviated the sketch completely. And they get on the computer and get things going on that. And they come up with a lot of splintered forms or whatever. You come up with some deconstructive fantasies, so to speak, and it wasn't as if the heart or the mind was doing it. It was a machine that was coming up with it. I may be naive to think in those terms, but I still feel, and the best guys, and I remember visiting Charles Guathme in his office, and he sketched, and then it would go to someone that was well versed with a computer. But here the student starts with a computer, and they come in for a critique, and we're talking about something that is so voluminous. They come in with an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and it's very difficult for me, with a vision of scope, to look at something, and I'd have the vision of scope, but it wasn't a total scope. I'd have to move out in order to see the whole picture before.
So you consider the lost art of drawing to be
drawing.
lamentable then?
To be what?
To be lamentable. You're lamenting the lost.
Oh,
the
yes,
lost art of
absolutely.
drawing.
But I still, believe in the use of the computer. But, as a matter of fact, at Smith, Hinchman and Grills, we were using the computer as far back as 1963. And it was a room. The computer was a room at the
Yes.
time. We had these little cards. But that computer was not being used in the essence of the form that was being established in design. It was being used as alternatives. As an example, there was a parking garage that we were doing over. Well, what is it? What are the attributes or virtues of doing this parking garage in this space over 2 levels versus 3 or 4 or 5? And for alternatives, but design wasn't being predicated by that. And of course, we use it for our payroll as well and our
Yes. Yes.
other things to manage
So
time.
So business practices.
Exactly.
Well, what about time management? To manage time, how important is that?
Well,
for
there's
an
got to be a
architect?
balance between one and the other, and the reason that I think of that, as elementary as it may be, is in terms of time. You're going to be dealing with this as a professional. You're dealing with this with your instructor, who at the time also serves, whether you realize it or not, will also serve as a mock client. So when he's critiquing a concept or a drawing with you, he's also thinking in terms of a client. He could be the client doing that just as well. And the same thing holds true with respect to the timing. If you've promised somebody that you're going to have it in such time, then you would have to honor that because he is also serving as your client. And so that's why I think, and it sounds very, very elementary and probably kindergartenish, but I think it's an important part of a habit that they need to learn. And
So how does the habit manifest itself in the profession when students learn it? I mean, so what if you don't deliver on time in the profession? What happens?
well, you can be very, depending on what your function is in a profession. If you're a project manager or even a designer and you've got a limit on, and you'll have to understand that we're in a real world and there are man hours that are assigned to a project based on its budget costs. And so those man hours are then distributed to different departments.
So architecture is not just about your passion, it's also a business.
Oh, absolutely.
And without
And
the
those-
business,
and
you
believe
can't
me,
practice your passion.
Yeah, well, but the thing is, let's look at some of our celebrated guys. Now, Frank Gehry, I think he's a great architect, very humble guy. We've had him here, I know that we've had him here at least once. I don't know whether he's come back a second time. But then he was here and then he was down at the museum, the DIA, many years ago. But he's a very humble person. I mean, when he talks, you can understand what he's saying. He's so easy, so simple, and not pedestrian by any means. But then again, and I don't know whether I can be critical of my colleagues, but it's not a matter of being critical. I'd like to think perhaps it's an opinion of mine rather than it's being critical. You take, as I said, Frank Gehry, and you take another, and one comes to mind is Tom Main of Morphosis, who just recently completed a building for
Another
Cooper
Los
Union.
Angeles firm as well.
Another Los Angeles who's completed a building for the engineers and architects, mostly engineers and other subjects, at Cooper Union. And I've not seen the building, unfortunately, but I've seen so many photographs as an alumnus that keeps coming to me for monies that I might contribute, as you get from most all of your schools and whatever, philanthropies. And I can't believe what I'm looking at, because it's to me, it may be beautiful. But then again, having read Tom Main and having listened to him quite frankly, there are times when I really don't understand what he's saying, because he's such an elitist, as opposed to what Frank Gehry is very humble. Frank Gehry, I remember work that, as a student, I remember seeing some of the work that he was doing he worked for Rafael Soriano, West Coast architect, a die-hard internationalist, almost Miesian. And he worked in his office for many years. And when he went into his own practice, that is Gehry, he continued to do Miesian-like designs soon after. And in the 50s, perhaps 20 years later, all of a sudden, and prior to, maybe, about was it the 50s? No, 70s, when he began to get into the postmodernist mode. But I liked his postmodern. It was very different from some of the others, as an example, from what Venturi was doing as opposed to what he was doing. It was interesting because he was so involved with artists. And I remember a building he did with Klaus Oldenburg and several other artists that he'd worked with. And he himself is a true artist. And just looking at some of these buildings that he's done recently is look at the Barcelona, or is it the Barcelona, the museum? That wasn't in Barcelona.
Bilbao.
I'm sorry, Bilbao. When he did the Bilbao Museum, I mean, it's just pure artistry and sculpture, but beautiful and functional, as I understand. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll ever be able to see that. But he was good. And what I liked about his postmodern work was he had a lot of artistry in it, a lot of poetry, but more artistry. He had a building that he did for an advertising firm, and I've forgotten the name of that firm. But he had, heroic-sized binoculars that one would walk under as he entered to the building. And then he did Loyola with all of these disjointed firms, and then he did the Schnabel House. I love the sculpture that he did. I even like the one that he's had problems with most recently, and that one I've seen, which was up at Massachusetts, MIT. And he was running into problems with that. But that's what comes by doing things that are new, very new, and disjointed. And the research really hasn't all been done. And so the building as a building from the exterior is very interesting, appealing, very, you might say, Frank Gehry. But of course he had the minimal problems with structure and with water, rain, and things of that nature. And he's into lawsuits with it, but I think most of it's all been fixed at this point.
I attended Frank Gehry's gold medal speech at the National AIA Convention the year he received it. And he started his presentation before he talked about Bilbao and the Disney Auditorium and all of those projects. He began by thanking his firm and the firm and the business which made the adventurous nature of his work possible. So he really linked it to the economic profitability of the firm that allows him to do his work. You agree with that statement?
Oh, absolutely. I never disagreed. I just probably didn't get the thought out. You know, they have people in their offices who are crunching the numbers and watching all of, but they're being watched. I mean, it's not that he goes on endlessly with his designs, you know. There's a time when you have to stop, otherwise you're out of business.
A time to make decisions, right?
Exactly. Well, maybe that's the point, or the habit, is to make a decision and get on with it, you see.
If you were asked to deliver a commencement address to a group of students, let's say graduates in architecture from Lawrence Tech, what would be the important thoughts that you would like to share with them?
Well, you know, I thought about that, knowing that you'd probably ask a question like that, and I made some notes. The first thing I would do is I'd probably refer to all of those items that we've reviewed that were habit forming, and not the very elementary ones, but those others in terms of dedication. And then I would, on top of that, then I would encourage the students to actively engage in the healing of our environment. And you'll notice I haven't said very much about, the architecture in terms of its being sustainable, because I'm of the old generation. That not that I don't believe in sustainability, I do, to the nth degree. And we were practicing all those things in a very, in a limited manner, but they were there. We talked about trees that would help the environment in terms of shielding this or that. We talked about berms. We talked about, and we talked about photovoltaics. I can go back 20 years ago when I was talking about it. I did a competition of some sort, and it had to do with photovoltaics and solar panels and things of that nature. But in general terms, I would dwell on all of that and on the environmentally conscious design techniques in the field of architecture that come to be within the last 10 some odd years. And in the broadest of terms, or the broadest context, I would probably describe the importance of sustainable architecture in seeking to minimize the negative environmental impact of buildings by enhancing efficiency and modernization in the use of material and also in the development of its space. And hopefully, with all of that, I would hope that those students, as they move on in their careers as architects, they abide by all of that. And I think that's where I stand on sustainability.
Yeah.
If I could drop a few holes into my backyard and come up with a geothermal way of saving a lot of water and also and energy,
easy, right?
I would do that. But unfortunately, I don't have the room, and I just couldn't afford it at this point.
Well, so many schools of architecture today are starting programs in sustainability as a specialty area. Why isn't it that sustainability is just part of what we teach as architecture, and it doesn't have to be anything special? All architecture should be sustainable, shouldn't it?
I don't know. It's hard for me to find an answer to that, because we were doing it. We just weren't pointing it out as it's being pointed out to us now. But I think there's what you have to appreciate. Teaching is a profession. It's also a business. Architecture is a profession, but it's also a business. So when you think of those two things, you think in terms of marketability. Oh, whoa. Now we can have an architectural degree in sustainable architecture. That means it's a monetary response to a profession.
It's our own business.
It's the
business of education.
That's what it is. I mean, quite frankly, and I don't want to get into religion, but I will for a moment.
This is your time. You can get
I've been
into
a member
whatever
of
you
my
want.
church here in Michigan, in my parish, for 50 years. And I've been involved in the architectural complex. Been involved in looking over, because I wouldn't dare pull any of this work into my office, because we certainly would have lost our hats in terms of doing it. But I hired architects we started with a banquet hall first. We then went into classrooms, Sunday school. After that, we then had a formalized administrative area, then a gymnasium, and then finally the church. Now, when you look at that, it's all monetarily related. It was all done so that we could keep the church as active as possible. Not a bad thing, but a good thing. And all churches, everybody is doing it. And that's what life's all about. So, economics. Okay.
John, we really want to thank you for sharing your time and insights with us. I was just wondering if you had any comments to share with us upon departing this interview.
I do. And as perhaps I've mentioned earlier, that I feel as a teacher I'm better extemporaneously in a classroom or in a lecture hall than I perhaps am with all of these cameras looking at me. I'm one of those supposedly actors that has stage fright. But in any event, I knowing that, again, you would ask me for a denouement or whatever they call it, a question with the last question in a series of questions. I'm going to respond in this manner, and I've made some notes here. First, to thank Lawrence Technological University and my colleagues at the College of Architecture and Design for their extended courtesies over the many years. I enjoyed being with students and learning as well. Secondly, as a member of the American Institute of Architects for over these 50 years, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge them as well. They have had a profound effect on my career and have prepared me to become the architect and educator that I am, or was today, or yesterday. My formative years, followed by internship and then registration for license to practice architecture, were enhanced by or with membership in the AIA. This successfully furthered my development in dealing with major challenges in my personal and professional life. And as an emeritus member, I continue to be active in the Detroit chapter and with the Michigan Society, their functions, attending meetings, serving on committees with colleagues, and guiding those interested in pursuing a career in architecture. And lastly, everything I do and have done has, in one way or another, had its beginning as a member of the American Institute of Architects.
Well, very good. On behalf of two organizations, as a member of the American Institute of Architects myself, and also as Dean of the College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Tech, really want to thank you for your contributions that you've made to both organizations, and really want to thank you for the time that you've taken for this interview today.
Thank you for having me here.